Georgia flood insurance. What are the essential things you need to know as a homeowner? If you're a homeowner or a potential home buyer in Georgia, there's some very important things you need to know. If you're looking at purchasing flood insurance, if you're looking at a property that's a special flood hazard area. Look, these are things I wish I would have known when I bought a house in a Georgia flood zone more than 10 years ago. So in this video today, we're gonna show you those 10 things, what you need to know to protect yourself as a property owner or a potential homeowner in Georgia. Let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about things like flood insurance pricing. Now, how much coverage do you need? We're going to talk about what flood zone you might be in and a lot of different other things in these 10 questions for you. So let's talk about the first thing when it comes to Georgia flood insurance. We got to understand, what is flood insurance in Georgia? Flood insurance, like you can see here behind me, you see this water here? This is what we call surface water. Flood insurance covers things that are coming into your house from outside when it comes to surface water. We're not talking about groundwater where water's coming out of the ground. We're actually talking about surface, talking about things like rivers, lakes, rainfall. If you're in areas like Savannah, Georgia, maybe storm surge. If you're in Augusta, Georgia, maybe the Savannah River overflowed, came rushing in your house. Or maybe you're on Jackson Lake in Butts County and you have an issue there. Or you're in Atlanta, Georgia, where the Chattahoochee is known to overflow. These are all things that fall under flood insurance in the state of Georgia. Why do you need flood insurance in Georgia? But as we mentioned earlier in this video, Georgia has a lot of different flood risks. You've got coastal Georgia, so you've got areas like St. Simon, Brunswick, Georgia, Tybee Island. All these areas have multiple exposures here. If you live in these areas, you've got the storm surge potential. You've got a lot of wetland area that fills up with water very quickly. You've got a lot of flat areas like Savannah, River Street, all these areas along the Savannah River that can still flood. Even though they're in coastal areas, they can flood as a result of the river. Augusta, Georgia, completely different risk than maybe something in Savannah or Brunswick, where you've got a lot of flooding from large amounts of rainfall. You've got a lot of flooding potentially from also the Savannah River because of how it runs. Macon, Georgia, you've got a lot of different flood exposures there from different rivers and lakes. Jackson, Georgia, you may have the exposure of rainfall there. You may have the exposure of Jackson Lake flooding. Same thing with Lake Oconee. Even though a lot of these lakes are managed by Georgia Power, it doesn't mean the flood threat's not there. Now, what's important to understand is in Georgia, everybody's got a flood risk. And you can find that flood risk score by clicking in the description of this video. This is going to tell you, hey, what are the actual chances of your property here in Georgia flooding over a 30-year period? Remember, everybody in Georgia has an exposure to flooding. It just may be a different risk. So everybody needs flood insurance in Georgia. The recent floods in Augusta, Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia have shown this at. The history of the 1990 flood in Augusta that I watched my dad almost get washed away in a vehicle through a flash flood. The 2009 flood in Atlanta. The 93 flood in Macon that took out an entire interstate system. You see, flooding in Georgia has a history. So when it comes to flood insurance in Georgia and reviewing your Georgia flood insurance policy, you definitely want to make sure that you've got one. Now let's talk about what flood insurance options are available here in Georgia. You've got the National Flood Insurance Program and you've got private flood insurance. Let's talk about National Flood Insurance Program first. The National Flood Insurance Program, also known as federal flood or federal government flood, is done through the federal government. All coverages should be the same, and you're going to be able to get certain coverages for your building and your contents. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about flood coverages. Now with private, you've got building coverage, you've got contents coverage, you've got something called additional living expenses. So these are the two options. Remember, private flood insurance is through a private company. While the National Flood Insurance Program is going to be available to anybody who participates in that program, which is about 98% of communities in Georgia, private flood may not be available everywhere. There may be certain risks that private companies don't want to take on. It's also important to understand that not every private company looks at risk the same. You may have one that gives you a $4,000 rate, one that gives you a $400 rate. That's why it's important to work with a flood insurance broker that has at least 5 different private flood insurance options for you so they can understand long-term what the best fit for you is and the best fit for your needs when it comes to coverages. Now let's get on to those flood insurance coverages in Georgia. We've talked about building, contents, and additional living expense. With the National Flood Insurance Program, you can get building coverage up to $250,000 on residential building. That covers things like potentially your appliances, your cabinets, things that are physically attached to your building, like your air conditioner, your furnace, and all these things. It's what's going to be typically covered here. Now, what's important to understand is if you have a basement here in Georgia, coverages are going to be limited to things that make it safe generally with the National Flood Insurance Program. We're talking about like a furnace, we're talking about a water heater, staircase, circuit breakers. Potentially a freezer or a fridge may fall under contents coverage in a basement, but basement coverages are very limited. So if you decide to finish out your basement here in Georgia, just know your coverages are going to be very limited. You probably won't be able to get coverages for your carpet, for your potentially even your drywall. So just remember that. Now, contents coverage. With the National Flood Insurance Program, you can get up to $100,000 in contents coverage. It's important to understand though, with contents coverage, that's not paying replacement costs. So if you have a TV that's destroyed and it was bought 10 years ago, you're gonna get what it cost to replace it 10 years ago, not today. That's an important thing to remember with the National Flood Insurance Program. Now let's talk about private. Now, private flood insurance does not limit coverages up to $250,000 on your building. That means if you got a $750,000 house in historic Savannah that you're wanting to protect, private might be a better option for you. And on contents coverage, you can actually get replacement costs in many situations on your content. That's very important for you if you got brand new things in your house. You may be also be able to get more basement contents coverage on your private policy here in Georgia. We see it every day. Now, it may not be a lot, but typically it could be a lot more than the National Flood Insurance Program. Now let's talk about something called additional living expense. This is a coverage that's not offered through the National Flood Insurance Program as we shoot this video here in 2024. And this is, let's say you have your house is destroyed or damaged by a flood and you need somewhere to stay. This is where additional living expense kicks in. And we had a customer in Nebraska that had this happen. She was the only one on her street that had private flood insurance, and she had additional living expense. And she had a hotel paid for 6 months when her neighbors had nothing. This took a huge financial burden off of her. So imagine going through your claim, not having to worry about that. That could be a huge benefit for you as a Georgia homeowner. You know, not having to worry about that and having to worry about that extra cost and all these things. So think about that when you're getting your private policy here in Georgia. Now let's talk a little bit about flood zones. You know, is your Georgia property in a designated flood zone? Yes, it is, more than likely. And the reason is it may be in a low risk, it may be in a high risk. You can find your flood zone by clicking in the description of this video. And you're gonna find things like flood zone X. You're gonna find things like flood zone A, flood zone AE, or if you're in the coast in Brunswick, Tybee, you may even find yourself in flood zone V as in Victor. So let's talk a little bit about those real quick. Special flood hazard areas or high risk areas are called flood zone A, flood zone AE, or flood zone V. These fall within the 100-year flood area. This means that if you live in these areas and you have a mortgage, generally your mortgage company is going to require you to have it. But if you're in flood zone X, it's going to be called low risk. And this means the mortgage company is not going to require it here. Does this mean that you do not need flood insurance if you're in one of these areas? Absolutely not. Almost 30% of claims come out of flood zone X because of events like flash flooding that we've seen recently in Savannah, Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, Augusta, Georgia. We can go on and on across the country about these events as they're happening. So those are briefly some of the flood zones in Georgia. Has your Georgia property ever experienced flooding? This is a question we get every day, and this can be kind of challenging to answer. So there's a couple different ways you can get this answer. If you have a National Flood Insurance Program policy, you can actually reach out to the National Flood Insurance Program to get a list of potential flood losses on your property all the way back to the 70s. They keep this. The challenge is if you've ever had private flood insurance claims, they're not going to show up there. So if you're looking at purchasing a Georgia property, with Georgia being a disclosure state, you want to ask these two important questions to protect yourself. And that is, has your property ever flooded since you've owned it or lived in it? This should protect you if you're buying it from an investor. Like I bought my Georgia property from an investor when it was in a flood zone and they didn't disclose that. Maybe this will help you avoid the headache that I went through of finding out 10 days before closing that flood insurance was going to be required and it was going to be $3,000 instead of it being the $300 that I got it at. So remember that. These are the questions you want to ask to find out if your Georgia property has ever flooded. Remember, when we're talking about flooded, we're not talking about your pipes bursting. We're not talking about your toilet backing up. We're talking about surface water like we talked about at the beginning of this video. Is there an elevation certificate available on your property here? Maybe. Now, unlike states like Florida, most of the counties do not keep these on file. So the best way to look is if you've bought your house recently from someone, ask them if they had an elevation certificate. Or if you want to get one, you can reach out to a surveyor. You can find a link in our comments here of trying to find a surveyor or someone who can help you get this elevation certificate. Now, what is an elevation certificate? An elevation certificate is a certificate that basically shows the different elevation of your home compared to the base flood elevation. This is the level that FEMA thinks flooding could come to. So if this lake or river rises to this level, this might be the FEMA flood level, the base flood elevation. So it's important to understand that. Now the good news, in 2024, you don't generally need an elevation certificate anymore to get flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program. However, it can still help you in private, but it can also help you change your flood zone, like I changed mine here in Georgia, significantly increasing my property value when I went through that process. So you want to remember that. What does flood insurance typically cover and not cover? So here in Georgia, there's a lot of things that flood insurance covers and it doesn't cover. You know, we talked about earlier in this building about different coverages. We're talking about building, contents, additional living expenses. You know, what it doesn't cover things like bursting pipes, your toilet backing up. You know, those are things that would fall under a traditional Georgia home insurance policy. So you want to make sure you have both these policies in place. And if you need to connect with a Georgia home insurance agent, you can click on the link in this comment, reach out to us. We'd be happy to match you up with one here at the Flood Insurance Guru. But you know, it talks about things like your building and your contents. You know, it's not going to necessarily replace a lot of things like your home insurance would. So remember that when you're trying to decide, hey, what does a flood insurance cover? What does it not cover? Remember, it covers things that are destroyed by a flood. It doesn't cover things that weren't destroyed or damaged by a flood. So you've got to understand, you understand that definition. Remember, the National Flood Insurance Program defines a flood as either 2 properties or 2 acres of normally dry area that inundated with water. Now, one of these has got to be your structure where water has come into it. So that's the flood definition and how, you know, those things are going to be covered or not covered. How much flood insurance coverage do I need here on my home in Georgia? You know, this is a question I had more than 10 years ago. Well, I can just cover it for the loan amount. That's all I really need. My house is never going to flood, right? This is where most people are wrong, especially with the way flash flooding is happening. The other thing where it's wrong is they're just covering the loan amount, but they're not really. And that is, generally when someone does just a loan amount, they're actually getting an actual cash value policy. This means that if you take out depreciation, about 60% you may not receive. In fact, we just talked to a property owner in Florida who was going through this with another insurance agency where they were very disappointed in their national flood insurance claim as they had this coverage amount for $150,000. The problem is the replacement cost on their home was $300,000 and they were only getting a check for like 50 grand. They were very upset. And this is why they were upset, is they didn't have replacement costs on the building coverage because they didn't have the max coverage available through the National Flood Insurance Program, or 80%. So when it comes to figuring out how much coverage you need, you want to look at replacement costs on your property, the actual cost to replace your building if it was to be completely destroyed. Click here in the link in the comments or in the description, and you can get an idea of what replacement costs should cost you on your property through our flood pricing calculator and how much coverage you do need there. Now let's talk about how much does flood insurance in Georgia cost? What is the average cost of flood insurance here in Georgia? This is a question I had when I was researching more than 10 years ago. And I found out at the time, oh, the average premium is $700. Well, I've got this rate for $3,000. Well, first of all, I was in the wrong flood zone. And back then, flood zones had a big deal on flood premiums. They don't as much anymore. Things like distance to water, replacement costs, the type of flooding, flooding frequency, elevation of a property. These are all things that determine how much a flood insurance policy is going to cost here in Georgia. So on the average cost here in Georgia, what we see is about $800 to $1,000 a year. So you just want to be thinking about that. Does that mean you're going to get a rate right around there? Absolutely not. This just means on average. So just be thinking about that. You may have a different rate if you're in Savannah or you're in St. Simons. You may have a different rate if you're in Atlanta, Georgia, where an area floods more because they're looking at flood frequency. But on thinking about the average cost of flood insurance in Georgia, remember that. Now let's talk about the best flood insurance in Georgia. And we hear from people all the time, hey, what's the best flood insurance option for me here in Georgia? Is it the National Flood Insurance Program? Is it private? It really depends on your needs. And you could do a combination of both here. You could take out a National Flood Insurance Program policy and do what's called an excess flood insurance coverage policy here in Georgia. This means you do a private policy on top of your National Flood Insurance Program, giving you expanded coverages that the National Flood Insurance Program doesn't cover. For example, you may be only able to get $250,000. And let's go back to that $750,000 example in that house. You want that additional $500,000 in coverage. This is where an excess flood insurance coverage policy could kick in to cover the difference for you. So when looking at the best flood insurance in Georgia, you want to make sure that you're looking at that. When you're looking at the National Flood Insurance Program or private, you want to look at rate increases. Remember, typically the National Flood Insurance Program has statutory rate increases of up to 18%. Private companies cannot renew, and they have no limitation on rate increases when they're what's called a non-admitted or surplus company here in Georgia. This means that they follow different state law because they're not licensed here in Georgia, because they're not admitted. This means they're going through different reinsurance companies like Lloyd's of London or different companies like that. So it's something you want to remember. So these have been 10 essential questions you want to ask as a Georgia property owner. Now look, maybe you've got more questions. Let us know in the comments so that we can answer those questions for you. Let us know what other questions you may want answered on your Georgia flood insurance policy or your Georgia home. I'm Chris, the Flood Insurance Guru, and I look forward to speaking to you in our next video. And remember, share, subscribe, and like the channel so others here in Georgia and other areas can find it. Thank you.